Okay, we're going to have a fun time here for the next 45 minutes or so, and that's because we're going to be talking about issues that are most important to you. And if they're not most important to you right now, they're going to be quickly. And before I get into the specifics of these, I first want to give you a little bit of a background about who I am and why I wrote this book. I spent the first 9 years of my life living in a very nice town outside Chicago, Lake Forest, Illinois. Both my parents were from the area. It never occurred to me that I'd live anywhere else, but one day my parents called a family meeting of their 5 children. At 9 years old, I was the second oldest, and they told us that we were moving. And what had happened was my father had lost his job, and the job he had gotten was to be a plant manager for a small manufacturing company in New Hampshire. What I didn't know then was that that was going to set the stage for the next, and the pattern for the next 10 years of my life, where every couple years my father would lose his job and our family was forced to pack up and move, often halfway across the country to wherever my father had gotten his next job. And my father didn't keep losing his job because he was unintelligent or not hardworking. My father was very intelligent, very hardworking, and he was very well educated. He had an undergraduate engineering degree and an MBA, both from Northwestern. What had happened was my father made a very fundamental mistake, and a mistake that he never corrected. And that is, he chose the wrong job for himself. Sometime early on in his career, my father decided that his path to success was to be as a manager of people. But the problem was, my father was a person who had very little ability to connect emotionally with people, and he was in fact a very solitary man. And the result was a very unsuccessful and painful career for him that over the years really destroyed his confidence in himself. But to my father's great credit and my eternal gratitude, every time he got knocked down, he kept getting back up, he kept fighting for the family, and the result of that fight was that he was able to send his 5 children to college. The college that I went to is Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, and I had a great 4 years there, academically, athletically, socially, and maybe most importantly, romantically. I had a great time at Bowdoin College, and when I graduated, I got a job in New York, working for the Bankers Trust Company. My job was to work out of their Empire State Building branch, and my job specifically was as a commercial lending officer, lending money to the fashion industry, the rag trade located in that area of Manhattan. I did that job for 2 years, and I enjoyed it, but after that period of time, I realized that for my career, I wanted something that was faster paced and had the opportunity for more compensation. And so I was able to get myself transferred downtown in the Wall Street area to the Bankers Trust trading floor. And for the next 3 years, I was a Treasury bond salesman. And that job was everything I hoped it would be. The markets were exciting, the atmosphere on the trading floor I just loved, and there was a chance for more compensation. After doing that for 3 years, I got a job at Morgan Stanley for 1 year, and then I got a job at a small bond trading firm in Greenwich, Connecticut called Greenwich Capital. And I was to stay at Greenwich Capital for 20 years. When I got to Greenwich, I was a salesman, then I was a trader, then I was a sales manager, co-chief operating officer, and finally the co-CEO. And Greenwich Capital wasn't just a great experience for me, it was a great experience for almost anybody that ever worked there. When I joined the firm in 1987, we had 75 employees. By the time I left, we had over 1,200. When I got there, we were sort of in an insignificant factor on Wall Street. By the time I left, we were ranked number 1 in 2 major business lines on Wall Street, the buying and selling of treasury bonds and asset-backed securities with customers. And finally, Greenwich Capital was highly profitable. For the 7 years that I was the co-CEO, we were 3 times more profitable per employee than Goldman Sachs, and historically, Goldman's the most profitable firm on Wall Street. What I haven't mentioned yet is my family. I did say that I had a great time romantically at Bowdoin. That's because I met my wife there, my wife Lee. What happened was I was a sophomore, she was a freshman, and she had been on campus for all of 2 days. And I saw her across the room at a fraternity party, and something came over me that's never happened before or since. I pushed my way through the crowd, and when I got to her, I didn't know what to do, so I literally grabbed the boy she was talking to and threw him aside, and he happened to be my best friend. And that was the most important and best timed act of aggression I ever perpetrated upon anybody in my life, because 8 years later, we got married. We've now been married for 29 years. We have 3 daughters, Avery, Kendall, and Cameron. And this book was inspired by my oldest daughter, Avery, who graduated from college in 2011. And unlike you all, she hadn't done anything to think about and preparing for post-college. And so after graduation, Avery landed back home with an English degree and no idea what she was going to do with that. And for the next 9 months, Avery did some things that were kind of worthwhile, some things that were kind of not worthwhile. Lee and I were starting to get pretty worried about this. But then Avery did something that was really smart. Avery sat down and thought about what she had always liked to do, and more importantly, what she was good at. And what Avery had always liked to do was acting. As a young girl, she wanted to be an actress for her career, but we all know that's a pretty tough road to go down. But what Avery had always had a real talent for was writing. And so Avery came up with this idea that maybe she could combine those 2 things for a career, or at least a job, in television production. So after a extended job search, Avery got a job offer. And it was to be the assistant to the co-executive producer of the Katie Couric Show on ABC. And Avery learned about the job offer when the co-executive producer called up Avery personally at our house where Avery was living and told her that she had the job. But then the producer said one thing that was very important. She said that she needed Avery at work Monday morning because the show was going to go live for the very first time in just a couple weeks. And so this was go time, so she needed Avery there Monday, and this was a Wednesday. So when Avery got off the phone and told Lee and I the good news, you would have thought it was New Year's Eve at our house. We were jumping up and down. We were so happy because we knew this was a great job and we knew Avery was going to be great at it. And this feeling of euphoria lasted until the next day when Avery sent Lee and I an email. And the email was very short. The subject was, "Is this okay to send?" And it was addressed to her new boss. And it said, "Thank you so much for the job. I can't wait to work with you. But would you mind if I didn't start work on Monday? I'd rather start work a week from Monday because I have some loose ends to tie up." And being Avery's father, I knew what those loose ends were. Avery was sick and tired of living at home with her parents, and she couldn't wait to get to the city, Manhattan, and start looking for an apartment. So when I read this email, my heart started pounding out of my chest, and it felt like my head was going to explode. And it wasn't because I was mad at Avery. I wasn't mad at her at all. It was because I was scared for her. Because I realized for the very first time that this daughter of mine, who was so smart, well-educated, and in some ways sophisticated, had no idea what the real world was about to demand of her. So in a sheer panic, I sent her an email, "Do not send, more to follow." And I sat down and furiously typed out in a stream of consciousness 22 bullet points of everything that I thought that Averys needed to know to be able to survive and succeed in the working world. And as a testament to just how concerned I was about this, I didn't stop with 22 bullet points. I kept writing for the next 18 months, and the result is this book. So, this book has maybe the longest title in the history of publishing. The Bigs, the secrets nobody tells students and young professionals about how to choose a career, get a great job, do a great job, be a leader, start a business, manage your money, stay out of trouble, and live a happy life. Now that's a mouthful. And as I started writing this book, I never intended to cover that many topics, but as I started writing, I realized these were the topics that I needed Averys to understand, and they're the topics that I wanted her sisters to be able to understand, and finally, they're the topics that I wished I had understood better when I was a student and then starting out in the working world. And so before we get to the question and answer part of the program, which is frankly the most important part, I'm just going to talk about a couple of those bullet points first. First, on how to choose a career. The most important thing you need to know about choosing a career is that the typical advice that you hear everywhere about that topic is sometimes very bad advice. And the advice that you hear everywhere is that you should follow your passion, do what you love. And if you do that, you'll never work a day in your life. It'll be so great. And if what you have a passion for and like to do is the same thing that you have a talent for and that you're good at, then there's no conflict. Full speed ahead, you ought to do exactly that. But if what you like to do is different than what you have a talent for, then I would suggest that you seriously consider doing what you like for a hobby and do what you're good at for your career. And the reason is that the working world is way too competitive to try to make a living doing something you're not good at. And the reason I feel so strongly about this, first and foremost, is because of my father, who tried to do a job in a career, pursue a job in a career that he was ill-suited for. And it had, frankly, tragic results for him. The other example, again, Averys. She's only been out of college for 3.5 years, but you know, she's doing great. She had a wonderful 2 years at the Katie Couric Show, got promoted a couple times. Now that show's off the air, and since the beginning of this past year, so she's been there a year, she's been working at a daily newsletter called The Skim, S-K-I-M-M, and I know some people recognize that. And you know, Averys one of the two girls that writes that every day. For those of you that don't know, it's a daily newsletter that summarizes the day's news. And you know, Averys doing something that she has a true talent for, and she loves her job and she's loving life. The other example that I want to mention is from my own career. When I had been at Greenwich Capital for 2 years, one day the founder of the company and my boss, a guy Ted Netzker, came by my desk and asked if he could buy me a hamburger after work. And of course I said yes. And over dinner, Ted told me that I had been doing a great job selling, and he wanted to more fully leverage my talents by making me a traitor at the firm. And you know, Ted was always a guy that I liked a lot and respected, and I thought that this was yet another stroke of genius on Ted's part, because while my career had been always as a salesman, I had always wanted to be a trader. And I just knew that I was going to be a great trader. So I enthusiastically accepted the job offer. And for the next 2 years, I proved myself to be maybe one of the all-time worst traders in the history of Wall Street. Now, that doesn't mean I lost the most money in the history of Wall Street, because I was a junior trader with junior trading limits, but I just couldn't make any money. And after 2 years, it was obvious to me that I needed to do something different with my career. And as I thought about it, the one thing that I was certain of is that I didn't want to go back to my old job in sales as a failure. I was open to doing anything else at the firm, but I didn't want to go back to sales as a failure. And so right about this time, Ted called me into his office and he said, you know, Ben, this trading thing's not working out very well. And that wasn't a surprise. I knew that more than anybody. But then he said something that really did surprise me. He said that what he wanted me to do was to become the chief financial officer, the CFO of Greenwich Capital. And you know, when Ted said this, I couldn't believe it. You know, being the CFO was one of the top 5 officers of the firm. And this was the greatest example of failing upwards that I had ever heard of in my life. And it was happening to me. But since I was so shocked by this suggestion, I didn't accept the job right away. And I said to Ted, thank you so much. Just give me a couple weeks to think about this and I'll come back to you with my answer. And so I did think about it for a couple weeks, and when I went back into Ted's office to talk to him about it, I told Ted that I didn't want to be the CFO, that I wouldn't accept that job, and what I did want to do was to go back into sales. The one thing in the whole world I had said just a couple weeks before I didn't want to do. And why did I have that change of heart? Well, it's because when I looked in the mirror, and more importantly, looked in my soul and tried to understand what I really cared about at that time of my life, what I really cared about most of all was getting back to doing something that I could help the team, the company win at, that I could make a positive contribution. And I didn't think that trying to learn yet a new job was the best way to do that. I thought the best way to do that would be to go back into sales. And so I went back into sales with a renewed appreciation for doing something that I was good at and a renewed determination to make a significant impact on the firm as a salesman. I was successful in that, and I rode that success to become the sales manager, co-chief operating officer, and finally co-CEO. And I think the important part of that story is that I am absolutely convinced that if I had accepted Ted's very generous offer to make me the CFO, I would have never become the CEO. And that's because I wouldn't have been playing to my strengths. I'm not an accountant. I didn't particularly like accounting. And if I had done that, I wouldn't have been able to lead by example. And so those are the reasons why I think it's so important for you to do something that you're good at for your career. The next bullet point I want to talk about is how to start a business. Now, not surprisingly, there's many more aspects to this that I can talk about in this short period of time, but there's just one piece of this that I do want to cover, and that is that every great company started out with one thing, and that's a great idea. And it's a great idea for a new product or service, or it's a great idea for how to deliver an existing product or service better or cheaper. And in my life, I haven't had that many great ideas, but I've had a few, one of which you've already heard about when I ran across the fraternity to meet my wife. That was a good idea, and I did something about it. Another was in 1980 when I graduated from Bowdoin College and I moved to Manhattan. And at that point, I really only wanted to do two things, and that is learn how to be a banker and keep having fun. And as part of the second part of that equation, soon after I got to Manhattan, I was asked to play on a softball team for a local bar that was very popular with young professionals. And I remember coming back to the bar after a game one night, and I had my jersey on, had a beer in my hand, all the all the young professionals all around. And I remember where I was standing in the bar at the time when I had a thought. I had an idea. And that idea was I could get all these people to come to my bar. The only problem was I didn't have a bar and I didn't have any money. But I had an idea. And so literally the next day, I came home from Bankers Trust, changed out of my suit and tie into t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers, and went walking around the Upper East Side looking for a bar that looked like it could use some extra customers. And the first place that looked promising was a bar I had never seen before, and it was called the Tumble Inn. And as I say in the book, it was the most rundown, forlorn, beat-up looking bar I had ever seen on the East Side, and it didn't get any better when I walked in. When I walked in, there was two old guys that were about to fall off their bar stools, and there was one old white-haired lady behind the bar. And I kept going back to the bar numerous times over the following weeks, and I discovered that that white-haired lady behind the bar's name was Margie Bruno, and she was the owner of the bar, and importantly, she had 8 years left on her lease. And she really didn't have many customers. And so I made Margie a proposition. I said, let's be partners, and we'll do it this way. We'll first pay all the bills of the bar, then we'll pay you a salary more than you're making right now, and after that, we'll split everything 50-50. That's what we agreed to, and the first thing I did was to take out the small amount of pathetic furniture that was in the bar, put a DJ in the back, bought a big screen TV, which back in those days was as deep as it was wide for the ball games, and I promoted the bar to my young professional friends. And while we had our ups and downs, particularly in the early days of the Tumble Inn that I talk about in the book, that bar became one of the most successful and absolutely probably the wildest bars in Manhattan for the next 8 years. And I think the most interesting part of this to me is that owning a bar is something that I had never considered before. You know, an awful lot of people think that that would be a really fun thing to own a bar someday. You know, I always liked going to bars, but it never occurred to me, literally, that I would own a bar. But that one moment in time, I had that idea and I did something about it. The last idea that I'll mention is the book that most of you have right now. And, you know, like owning a bar, many people think that they'd like to write a book someday. But I didn't. It never occurred to me that I would write a book. But Averys sent me that crazy email that set off a chain reaction, and the result is this book that, you know, quite honestly, is probably one of the most rewarding and enjoyable things I've ever done. So it's, you know, the key thing about this is to understand that good ideas are rare and they're precious. And if you have a good idea, you can't just let it walk out the door. You got to wrap your arms around it, find out if it's an actionable idea, and if it is an actionable idea, you have to have the confidence to do something about it. The last thing we're going to talk about before we go to the questions is how to live a happy life. Now, this is by far the most important thing that I'm going to tell you and that we're going to talk about. And the important thing for you to understand about living a happy life is that happiness is a choice. And when I say happiness is a choice, that does not mean that I'm encouraging you to wake up in the morning and put a smiley face mask on, grinning from ear to ear, and sally forth in the world and think that's happiness. That's not happiness, that's delusional. But you can raise your average level of happiness if you do one thing, and that is to shorten the amount of time that you allow yourself to be unhappy. Now, we're all human beings. Every single day that I walk around, something, sometimes numerous things, will make me angry, upset, or agitated. Sometimes very mildly, sometimes, you know, very significantly. And in the past, when those things would happen to me, I would just let Mother Nature take its course, and over a period of a half an hour, maybe a day, week, month, a year, depending on how serious it was, it would finally dissipate and I wouldn't be upset about that issue anymore. But when I came to understand that happiness was a choice and nobody was making me be unhappy, I realized that I could shorten that time frame down dramatically. And so now, whenever anything happens that makes me angry or mad, the next thought that comes into my mind is I'm losing. And that's because I want to be happy. And so I concentrate for the next 15 seconds, the next 30 seconds. It doesn't normally take much longer than that to do one of two things. Either to get a plan for how I can correct whatever is making me unhappy, or to accept it if it's something that I can't control. And once I started doing this about 20 years ago, I got to tell you, it was absolutely transformational in my life. And when I do talk to young people about this, I can sometimes just feel that they're like, well, that's all fine, but I'm perfectly happy. What I really care about, and the reason why I'm listening to this old guy talk, is to maybe get some tips about how to be successful professionally. Well, what I will tell you is that there is absolutely nothing you can do that will have a greater chance of raising your professional success than raising your average level of happiness. Why? Well, it's pretty simple. Happiness is like a magnet. People want to work with and for happy people. And unhappiness is like a repellent. People don't want to work with or for unhappy people. So if the only thing you cared about in the world was professional success, there's nothing you can do that will ensure that to a greater degree than raising your average level of happiness. And by the way, there's a lot of things we're going to talk about, and we've already talked about, that you can't do as you sit there right now. You can do this. You can just say, yeah, I'm gonna give that a try. And if you did it, I virtually guarantee that it would be transformational for you in so many ways. I just have one last thing that I would like to mention to you all, and that is that this project of the Bigs has really been exciting for me, and the reason it's been exciting is because it's gotten me to places like Elon and meeting people that I wouldn't have met otherwise. But one of the things that I did as part of this project is that I wrote a op-ed piece that was published by the New York Times Labor Day of last year. And the point of the op-ed piece was that colleges should require career training from students for all 4 years. And I got a lot of very positive feedback about that. A lot of people got in touch with me. But the most interesting group that got in touch with me on the back of that op-ed was the U.S. ski team. And specifically, the person who is in charge of education for the U.S. ski team to make sure that the skiers go to high school, go to college, and ultimately are prepared for the working world afterwards. And the U.S. ski team is comprised of about 190 men and women, and about 30 of them turn over each year because somebody's younger, faster, jumps higher than they do. And so this head of education called me up and he said, I read your article, I got your book, I read that. The information that you have in that is exactly what I need our skiers to understand. And that obviously felt great, and he said, can you help me? And I said, sure, I'm going to go to Park City this summer and help teach the skiers basically this book. But then he said the thing that was really exciting, which he said that the biggest challenge that he had was getting his skiers as excited about the next 60 years of their life as they were about the first 30. When they were world-class athletes. And he said, that is a big challenge, and do you think, Ben, that you could help me with that? And when he said that, it was like sent an electric shock of recognition through me. And that was because that is exactly what I've tried to do in writing this book and then going out and talking about this book. And so often when I'm out speaking and talking to students, what I hear is, I know that I have to go get a job. And what I say to them is, you got it all wrong. You don't have to go get a job. You get to go get a job in the greatest country with the greatest economy and the most opportunity in the history of mankind. And if you have that opportunity, it will become self-fulfilling because it's people with that attitude that companies want to hire. So that's the final thing I want to leave you with. If you can take that sort of energy, determination, resilience out into your job search and into your careers, you will be successful. I absolutely promise you. So I guess there's going to be a reception after this. I'm going to be there, happy to sign books, talk to people, whatever. But thank you all for coming out. It was a great turnout.